Hi everyone, this is Morgan, and in this video I'm going to walk through the second phase of film development, aka after you've already loaded film into the tank. So before we move along to talking about chemistry, I just want you to hold your horses and make sure that you've cleaned up after the film loading process. So you should have your canister, you should have the spool, put in this little tin that will be in the film loading room so that those materials can be recycled. You also want to throw out any little film strips that are lying around. In terms of planning, you'll need to find out how long you need to develop film. So that changes for each unique make and ISO of film. This is the film development chart that you'll have access to. You need to find your film, figure out the dilution that you're going to use, find the ISO you shot it at, and make sure that you're finding the 35 millimeter development time. This chart can be a little overwhelming to read, so we'll walk through it here, but also feel free to ask me or a lab tech for help if you're ever confused. Most of you will be shooting with Ilford HP5 Plus, the 400 speed, so I would like you to use the 1-to-1 dilution. You're going to mix equal parts water and developer. So if you shot it at 400 ISO, that means your development time will be 13 minutes. There might occasionally be a good reason to use the stock solution, and I'm recording this demo during the coronavirus pandemic, so you might have times where you need to be out of the lab by a certain time. You might just want to minimize contact. So while I'd like you to avoid using the stock or undiluted solution whenever possible, just so you can save on chemistry, if you're ever in a real pinch, you can always use the stock version of our developer chemistry for shorter development times. In this case, it is 7.5 minutes, which is a little over half of what you would need to spend if you were using the 1-to-1 dilution. The next thing you need to figure out is how much chemistry you will need. So on the bottom of your tank, there's actually writing that tells you exactly how much chemistry is required to cover each roll of film. So here it is on the bottom. You will see that for a 35 millimeter reel, you need about 300 milliliters or 10 ounces, whichever measurement makes more sense to you, of each chemical to cover the reel completely. So that's important to know so that when you lay out all your chemicals, you know how much to pour. Also, notice that if you're developing two 35 millimeter rolls at the same time, you would need 600 milliliters or 20 ounces of chemistry to cover both reels. When you figure out how much chemistry you need, you will lay out each of the different chemistry bottles and find corresponding beakers that you can use to measure out however much chemistry is needed. So you'll see I have my developer with a corresponding beaker that's labeled with developer, stop with a corresponding beaker that's labeled stop, and then fixer with a corresponding beaker labeled fixer, and then finally hypo-wash. So for me, since I'm only developing one roll, I'm measuring out 300 milliliters of each chemistry, and I wanted to focus on the developer for a minute longer than I'll focus on some of the other chemical stages, just because developer is sort of one of the odd stages out. Developer is distinct for a few reasons. One, we've already figured out you need to determine how long your developing stage is based on your film. Every other stage is consistent, and the type of film you shot with doesn't matter. Developer is also the only chemical that you will need to dilute to use, or that you could dilute to use depending. So additionally, developer is one of the few chemicals, I guess it's really just developer and photo flow at the tail end of this process, that you'll dump down the drain, which makes sense because you diluted it. So here you just see me using the 1-to-1 dilution. You see I've poured 150 milliliters of the stock solution. I'm adding 150 milliliters of room temperature water, and that creates 300 milliliters of working developer solution. So the next thing I'll do is pre-wash film for 1 minute, which just means I measured out about 300 milliliters of room temperature water, and I took off the lid of my tank, poured the water through the funnel, again, which is a pretty light, tight system, and agitated the water for about 1 minute. This is actually agitation happening. It just really means moving around water or chemistry in your tank so that there's constant new chemistry coating your film. Chemistry can be exhausted, so this stage is important. Once your pre-wash is over after about, again, a minute, dump the water down the drain. Just notice if it has a color. Sometimes this is just a fun part of the process. The next stage is the developer. So you want to pay attention to when you add the developer so it's easy to keep track of your 13 minutes. Again, open up that lid, pour the developer into the tank, and your first move should be to agitate it. Going over to the sink is smart. Chemistry will splash around quite a bit, but doing an agitation that's a little bit more intense for the first minute is great to just get chemistry moving around. Tapping the bottom of the tank on the sink edge or the sink itself is also an important part of agitation. You want to make sure any air bubbles are released so that you don't have a tiny little air bubble covering over a piece of your film that will not get developed in that case. So I'm going to speed the video up from here. This is a 13-minute development time. So the main thing you need to pay attention to, again, is that about every 30 seconds, you agitate for 5 seconds. A lot of times I completely upturn the tank 3 times and then tap the bottom of the tank to release air bubbles, and that lasts approximately 5 seconds. So just keep tabs on not only your overall development time, but those 30-second checkpoints. And hopefully you also are talking, listening to music, doing something lightly entertaining during this longest stage of the process. At about this point, we started developing a second roll of film loaded into a completely different tank. This was, I think, Arista EDU Ultra 400, which had a much shorter development time of 6.5 minutes. So starting it later was helpful because now the processes kind of sync up with each other. So it's pretty easy to develop 2 different tanks at the same time. Also keep in mind, if they had the same development time or similar development times, we could have loaded 2 reels loaded with 35mm film into the same tank. So when that 13 minutes was up, developer is again one of the few chemicals that can go right down the drain. So you see both tanks being emptied in this video. A huge mistake happened in this video that I think is worth pointing out. So the first tank gets emptied. No problem. The developer goes right down the drain. That's where it belongs. No worries. When the second tank is emptied, try to notice what goes wrong. Okay, so this is like the classic film development nightmare, is the film has been developed, but then it falls out. So it gets exposed to light. It's not light, it's still light sensitive. So this is not what you want to have happen. That said, we just put the film right back into the tank and kept on moving with the process, hoping that there would be something salvageable. So the next chemical stage is stop bath, and stop bath is just designed to stop development from progressing too far. So we poured 300 milliliters of stop bath into each tank and agitated a little bit, but it's a short stage. It lasts a minute, so a couple 5-second cycles of agitation is all you need. So the big thing about stop bath to note is that at the end, you will not pour stop bath down the drain, please. No, you're going to pour it probably back into your stop beaker so it's easier to pour back into the glass jug that contains the concentrated stop bath. So after stop, the next phase is fixer. Fixer is arguably one of the most important phases of this whole process. Fixer is the stage that makes your film able to be viewed in light without damaging it. After this point, it's not going to be light sensitive. Fixer is a 5-minute process. So again, you don't need to dilute it. You will just pour, in our case, 300 milliliters of fixer into each tank. And over the course of 5 minutes, you will agitate for about 5 seconds every 30 seconds. Just as a quick note, during agitation, it is normal to lose a little bit of chemistry just dripping out of the tank. But if you feel like you're losing a lot, like more than like a quarter of the chemistry in your tank, it might be good to check in with me or a lab tech to make sure everything's going okay. At the end of the fixer stage, just like with stop, you're going to pour the fixer back into the beaker, and then again, you'll pour the beaker chemistry back into the glass jug. It's arguably even more important. I mean, it definitely is more important to save the fixer than it is to save the stop, because fixer is really hard on drainage systems. So we don't want it just going into the water table. We definitely want to pour it back into the beaker, back into the glass jug. With this stage done, your film can be viewed in white light. So if you're really feeling nosy, you could pull out your reel, you could just lightly tug on the film to make sure you have images. I would encourage most of you to be patient for at least a few minutes longer, but that option's there if you need it. Otherwise, your next stage is to do a rinse. And to do that in the lab, you can just put the hose, one of the hoses from the sink, into the tank, pretty much right into the funnel, and just rinse your film for 1 minute. Just begin removing the fixer. Fixer is not something you want to live on your film for a long time, so it's important to remove all traces. The next stage is actually hypo-wash, which is completely designed to remove any final traces of fixer. Just like with stop and fix, you will end up saving the hypo-wash. It's just a 1 minute chemical bath with agitation every 30 seconds, so pretty darn similar to what you've just been through, which is why I'm not showing it here again, just to save on video time. After the hypo-wash, and again, after you've poured the hypo-wash back into the beaker, back into the jug, you will have a final wash, and that only needs to be 4 to 5 minutes. You put it in this little vacuum tube, and if for whatever reason this final wash isn't working, it's kind of finicky, you could always just do what you did for the rinse and just put the hose directly into the tank and into the funnel. Before you put your film in the dryer, you want to also prepare your photo flow. Photo flow is a chemistry that's just designed to help your film dry more evenly without water spots. So you see here, I'm pouring the tiniest amount of photo flow in. I'm not being worried about measuring exactly, but just a tiny bit of photo flow can be mixed with a lot of water. You'll know you have enough photo flow chemistry if you see suds. Add the photo flow to your tank, swish around for about 10 seconds, and then you're good to squeegee off either using a squeegee tool or your 2 forefingers before putting your film in the film dryer to be dried. This could take anywhere from about 15 minutes to a half hour depending on the humidity. You'll want to clip the top and bottom of your strip of film before adding it to the film dryer. You can see that here. You'll want to lock the door. And then here you can see you turn the machine on by dragging the dial to about this 20 mark. While your film is drying, you'll want to wash all beakers. You used every component of your tank just with warm water and leave it to dry. You will also probably need to clean off your workspace. You see me doing that here with the blue cleaning solution. It's almost inevitable that there will be some chemical mess. So wiping down the station when you're done with it is critical. After about 20 minutes, you can check to see if your film is dry. If it's at all tacky, leave it in longer. But if it's done, take it out, lock the film dryer door, and then make sure to turn off the machine. Don't just leave it running. So then you can take your film over to the light table and start looking at it. You'll first want to put it in negative sleeves. So most negative sleeves have 7 rows that can each hold 5 frames. So you see me counting here and making a cut every 5 frames right in that tiny bit of negative space in between each frame. So I'm just getting it ready to fit in those negative sleeves here. And I'll show you what that looks like. As a lovely surprise, the roll of film that was exposed to light during the developer turned out. It's fogged. You can see it's fogged because of the graying near the edges, but there are images, which is incredible. So at the end of this process, I had 2 developed rolls of film in negative sleeves and was ready to move on to the next stage. So if you made it this far, thanks everyone. This is a dense video. I really appreciate it. Good luck.